Selina, Countess of Huntingdon. Her dates are 1707 to 1791, and she lived till her 84th year and served God. Now, it's true that throughout the ages, women have played an essential and vital part in the unfolding purposes of God, and we could give a great long list, starting in Scripture with Miriam and Deborah and Hannah and Elizabeth and Mary and Priscilla and Lydia and all those great ladies we've just mentioned through the years. But we're talking about Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon, and a lady without whose support, humanly speaking, those important figures of the 18th century revival would not have been able to achieve what they did. Now, from her youth, this lady was a serious-minded individual. It's said that she had an extraordinarily quick brain and a very subtle mind, a very consistent, consecrated, determined sort of a woman. That's how she was naturally, but God uses our natural qualities and so on very much, and that was how she was. She was very intelligent, and I've got down here she had unusual powers of perception and observation. So she was born 24th of August 1707, the days of Queen Anne. That was the time of the union of parliaments between England and Scotland. Some say she was born in Ashwell House, now called Ashwell Castle, in Northamptonshire, which apparently I notice have been on the market lately for £1.5 million if you decide to buy it. Anyway, but others claim she was born at Staunton Harold in Leicestershire, which again, up to recently, was the home of Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Her father's name was Washington Shirley, who was the second Earl of Ferrers, and as his name suggests, he was an actual distant relative of the George Washington, and so on. Her mother was Mary Lavinge, which suggests some kind of a Huguenot connection, she was the daughter of Richard Lavinge, who was the Solicitor General for Ireland and Speaker of the House of Commons. And the family owned lands in Ireland, which I won't go into all the details, but you see right away this woman was very highly placed in society of that time. We mentioned her younger days before her conversion. She was very pious, very religious-minded, serious-minded woman. And she reacted against what you might call the tawdriness, the shallowness of the society of that time. We know something about the way some of the fashionable rich people lived in that age, very dissolute and not to be admired. And it's said that she went along, nevertheless, as was her role, was expected of her in society. She went along to the fashionable parties and balls of that age. But all the time, it's said, or she said herself, that she felt very uncomfortable and not at all impressed, not at all excited about such things as that. Now, in her early days, before her conversion, she took part in that, which I think was quite a significant event in the early part of the 1730s. That was when Thomas Coram gathered a group of people around him to form what came to be called the Foundling Hospital there in London. Captain Coram, he really was. He was a ship's captain. And there was quite a lot of well-to-do people, something like 21 or more aristocratic people he gathered round him to establish that great work. And one of them was the Countess herself. And she put a lot of money into it, and she enable the employment of solicitors, and she purchased herself the vellum, the paper, all the stuff that was needed to get the royal stamp of approval. Apparently you had to pay and do all sorts of jumping through hoops to get it. She did all that sort of work behind the scenes. But, coming together of groups, we'll mention that later on. I always think that great work, the Foundling Hospital, was perhaps one of the first sparks or indications of the near coming revival. Anyway, in June 1728, Lady Selina Shirley, as she was known then, married Theophilus Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon. He could boast of royal ancestors stretching back to the time of Edward IV, the Plantagenets and so on. He himself never professed an evangelical conversion, but he was supposed to be a man highly principled, moral principles, very wise sort of fellow, good-tempered, generous, beneficent sort of an individual. And though in his position at that time, he had to associate with people like the notorious Lord Chesterfield and Lord Bolingbroke, who are very men really to be avoided at all costs. We know something about their reputation. But he was a good man as far as men go, as it were, and it was a very happy marriage. And it brought Selina into even higher ranks of society. Now, I could just say here, as a young woman, she was quite high-spirited, never did anything immoral, anything like that. But she, with a group of friends, managed to get themselves into the House of Commons, not as elected members, I hasten to add, but they were protesting about something. And though women weren't allowed into the Commons of that, they somehow, by trickery and persuasion, managed to get in. So it just shows something of the nature of the woman before God moved in her life. But all these things he was to use later on. Now, how did she come to be converted? Well, it was along these lines. She had two sisters, and they both married husbands, ministers, that were later, one particularly, to play quite a significant part in the coming revivals. Now, her sister, Lady Margaret Hastings, married Benjamin Ingham. You may have heard of him. He was a well-known figure in the revival. Earlier he'd been at Oxford, part of the Holy Club, and he went on and gained the title, or some people said that he was the father of Yorkshire Methodism. So that was him, that was her sister, married him. And then the other one, Lady Catherine Hastings, married a lesser known individual, but no less godly, the Reverend Mr. Wheeler. I can't tell you anything about him, not even his first name. But these men and these sisters of hers, they witnessed to her of the things of God. And there was, as it were, this desire in her heart for something more than she was receiving, even though she was in a very wealthy and prominent place in society. Now, people describe her conversion experience. You know, those writers of old time had an amazing way with the English language, didn't they? I'm going to read one of them just for a while. I won't go on all of it because time is against us. But here's how one described her conversion. Now the day began to dawn. Jesus, the Son of Righteousness, arose and burst in meridian splendor on her benighted soul. The scales fell from her eyes and opened a passage for the light of life that sprang in, and death and darkness fled before. Viewing herself as a brand plucked from the burning, she could not but stand astonished at the mighty power of that grace which saved her from eternal destruction, just when she stood on its very brink, and raised her from the gates of hell to the confines of heaven. And so the writer goes on. But there was this woman wonderfully saved. Now, the members of nobility that she had associated with up to this point, even her husband as well, were taken aback and astonished at the change that took place in her life. And her husband he didn't oppose her in any way, but perhaps he was being a good husband when he felt worried, anxious about what had happened to her. And he had a word with his friend, Dr. Benson, who was at that time the Bishop of Gloucester. And he wondered whether the good bishop would just see his wife, just to check everything was in order, as it were. I put it like that. And the bishop complied with that. And well, perhaps he didn't realize too much what a woman he was dealing with. But he didn't have a lot to say, really. But she took the conversation, and she described to him that she had not departed one iota from the 39 Articles of the Church of England, and that everything that she had embraced and believed could be found in those articles. Dr. Benson said, or made it known, that perhaps he had acted a little bit too hastily in ordaining George Whitfield. But she had an answer for that. And she said this to the bishop: "Sir, mark my words, when you are on your dying bed, that will be one of the few ordinations you will reflect on with complacence." Well, she knew how to do it. And in actual fact, so they say, when Archbishop Benson came to depart from this world, he asked George Whitfield to pray for him. So her words were not in vain. Now, shortly after her conversion, John and Charles Wesley were preaching in the neighbourhood of Donington Park, where she was then residing, and she sent them a warm message of greeting and commended them in their work, and promised to do all that she could to encourage them in it. Now, I want to just say something again about her circumstances. Now, this is at the beginning of the revival. Her own son, Francis, his name was, came under the influence of that man we mentioned, the notorious Lord Chesterfield, and really was corrupted by his connection with that very corrupt man. She had that to deal with. And the son, even though his father was of a high moral standard and excellent standing in society, the son sank into the same kind of notoriety as Chesterfield. So she had that to do with. She had a cousin also, her father's heir. His name was Lawrence Shirley, who was so badly treated his wife. He was a wife beater, and apparently the authorities took her away from him, forced him to divorce her, which was very, very unusual in those times. So he must have been a very cruel man. Anyway, after the divorce, his land steward sent the poor woman £50 to help her financially. But when the Earl found out, he brought the land register fellow over and accused him of disappropriation of funds. But that wasn't the worst of it. He told him to kneel down on the floor. He took out his gun and shot him, just like that, as it were. Well, these were the sort of things that just shot him dead. So these were the sort of things that she was having to cope with. She was widowed when she was 39. They by that time had 6 children, and the family owned a large estate, and she had to then take over the management of it, which she did. But of course, she is now a Christian woman in this position, and she is, doing all that she can to help those that are living on their land. But she's got to try and cope with life, and what shall she do? Shall she now become a recluse, just hide away from all these things, or shall she try and do something with her life? Now, by this time, she's come to know Howell Harris, and he'll become, in a way, her pastor. And she takes her troubles, as we were thinking about earlier, to him, and tells him what she was contemplating, and he persuades her. She didn't need much persuading, to give her life wholeheartedly to the cause of Christ, which she did. And this was the time when she began holding these meetings in the drawing room of her house. And at first, Howell Harris conducted these meetings. She began to invite along her influential and aristocratic friends, and they had these almost weekly meetings and so on. When George Whitefield came back from America, where he was, he took over. I always felt a bit sorry for Howell Harris. He'd done all this, and then when George Whitefield came, he kind of put on one side. But anyway, George Whitefield then took over these meetings. We'll say something more about that. Now, the sort of people that came along, Arnold Allimore has helped us on this, and he's compiled a list. It's a very small writing, but it goes all down one page and all down halfway down the next page. I can't read all these names out now, but I just give you a short sample. Lady Fanny Shirley, who had long been one of the reigning beauties in the court of George I. She was there. The Duchess of Argyll, Lady Betty Campbell, Lady Ferris, Lady Sophia Thomas, Duchess of Montague, daughter of the great Duke of Marlborough, Lady Cardigan, Lady Lincoln, Mrs. Boscawen, Mrs. Pitt, Miss Rich, Lady Fitzwalter, Lady Caroline Petersham, the Duchess of Queensberry, daughter of the Earl of Clarendon, and it goes on and on and on and on. Anybody who was anybody at that time, at some point, she had invited to these meetings. Now, I mentioned those 2 infamous characters, Chesterfield and Bolingbroke. She even invited them. I should have said men came as well as these ladies, but she invited them. They were dissolute men. They certainly were far, far away from the gospel of Christ, but they came along. Now, Chesterfield was known in those days as a brilliant orator. Some called him the British Cicero. So he was a man who knew how to give a speech, you may say. Now, he's going to listen to George Whitefield, and this is what he said. It wasn't anything spiritual, but it was congratulatory, really. He said, Mr. Whitefield's eloquence is unrivaled, his zeal inexhaustible, and not to admire both would argue total absence of taste and insensibility, not to be coveted by anybody. Now, they weren't moved, but they were impressed by the way that he spoke. And actually, Lord Chesterfield's wife was converted through these meetings. And his wife was the daughter of George I. So you're talking with the higher echelons of society. George Frederick handled were seemingly converted through these meetings. And you think, what he went on to do. Talking of that music element, of course, around about this early time, you get the Countess of Huntingdon's hymn book, which is a very interesting hymn book, if you like hymns, and the way the book is set out. The way we normally set out hymn books now is to the glory of God the Father, and then God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and so on, the Trinity and providence and all those things. But some of these early hymn books didn't begin like that. They began with the conversion experience, descriptions of someone under conviction of sin, someone seeking, you see, and then someone finding, and then someone tempted, and then someone finding assurance, and so on. And several of those books from that period are like that. They're very good devotional manuals and helps when you're preaching for conversions and so on. Well, Tileman, writing on this theme here, he points out, he said, well, Whitfield and Hal Harris, they were preaching to those who were the leaders of society, politicians and very influential people, and the great members of the great aristocratic families of those days. And it was quite something, you see. She was, through this ministry and those who were preaching, directing the course of the nation in some respects. We need something like that today, somebody who can get through and open the minds of those who are ruling the place. So that was going on. And it said, Tileman says that he's writing in the 19th century, but he says the influence of these meetings spread right over to the present day. Well, we're talking about 1880 or something like that, but far-reaching influence. Now, because of this, another little sideline here is, of course, dissenters were not looked upon very favourably at that period in the 18th century. And, these people could have suffered because of that. But the fact that these meetings and these high-ranking people were going on protected the other dissenters in a significant way. Now, people complained to the king about these goings on. First of all, George II and then George III. And several bishops went to George II complaining of Whitfield and his followers' incorrigible misbehaviour, they called it. Anyway, the king listened to these complaints attentively, and what did he say? Make bishops of them all. Make bishops of them all, he said. As if, you who are bishops should learn something from these men and do it. And it was very, very similar with George III, came to the throne 1738. He also held Lady Huntingdon in high esteem. And again, the same criticisms came. And he said the same thing, make bishops of them all. And then somebody said, well, we couldn't make Lady Huntingdon a bishop, could we? To which the Queen Charlotte replied, it would be a lucky circumstance if you could. She puts you all to shame. So they didn't do any good complaining to the high officials of the lands. George III, speaking of Lady Huntingdon, said, there is something so noble, so commanding, so engaging about her, that I am quite captivated by her ladyship. She is an honour to her sex and the nation. So that's what he said. Now, another part of this now is the vast amount of work that she did in the strength of the Lord. Search for it, find it. God's holy work, it never is far away. Do it, with hand and with heart, the duties that call each day. She did that. You in your small corner and I in mine. She had a tremendous prayer life, which would be a subject in itself, labouring in prayer. Whenever these meetings that I mentioned were going on, she would slip out very often and just pray for the success of the ministry that was being delivered. She prayed for those who were living in her husband's estates and for the state of the nation and all manner of things. Apparently one sarcastic individual, somebody was saying, we don't see much of Lady Huntingdon these days. And this other woman rather sarcastically said, yes, we don't see her. She is probably somewhere praying with her beggars. You know, she stooped low. But the great life of prayer this woman had. But her calling to serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, let me all my powers engage to do my Master's will. Just as a sample of the sort of things she did, she found herself in Brighton at one point. That was a fashionable place in those days for people like her to go to. And she heard about a soldier's wife who had just given birth to twins but was not expected to live. And she decided she'd look this woman up and help her out, and at the same time teach her the things of God and the way of salvation. And she went to this sort of hovel where this woman was living, and went week after week. Really, the woman begged her not to stop coming. But this house, or hovel, really, was next door to a building that was a public bakehouse. Can you imagine such a thing? People, ladies would go there, and poor ladies, and bake their bread or whatever. But the walls must have been exceedingly thin, because as these ladies waited their turn at the oven, they could hear the conversation going on in the other next door, you see. And apparently this room filled with people just going to hear the conversation of Lady Huntingdon and the message she was bringing, messages of hope and salvation and consolation at the same time. So that was the sort of thing this woman was doing. Now, it's generally thought that Frederick, who was the Prince of Wales, but he never became it, he died before, but it's said that he was converted through these various ministries. Now, Lady Huntingdon was sort of always on the lookout for avenues of service. And we've already said she was a woman of understanding, vision, a clever woman in many respects. But she early in her life and ministry begins to realize this message that is now, this salvation that has come to her, must be taken hold of by the rising generation. And that's where she gets interest in universities, students in universities, and particularly Oxford and Cambridge, because she also realizes that these men would be perhaps one day ruling the country. They certainly have great influence in the land. So she has a special ministry to Oxford and Cambridge and students in it. As she put it, she said that so many of these men might be determined to be on the Lord's side, that they might be determined to be on the Lord's side, converted and serving God. She knew that. Networking was another thing she realized was important. Yes, she has got amazing connections in these afternoon meetings that she was organizing and carrying on. But she goes out of her way to court the friendship, or fellowship, better to say, of all kinds of ministers whose names these days now we know, we remember. Isaac Watts was very old at this time, but she gets to know Isaac Watts, Philip Doddridge, William Romaine, Henry Venn, Roland Hill, John Fletcher, and many others. John and Charles Wesley, of course, were amongst these. And she is encouraging them. She's showing an interest in them. They need it. They have plenty of opposition. She's encouraging them. And there was a time when there was almost a catastrophe. It had to do with Charles Wesley. I don't know about you, but I much appreciate his hymns. But we almost didn't get them because of what happened. We've heard of the Moravians, and we hear of the Moravians with admiration. We're not against the Moravians. But as sometimes happens, even amongst sound people, some of them can go wrong and overemphasize something or underemphasize something. And there were some of the Moravians, not many, but some, they adopted what was called, you may have heard of it, the stillness doctrine. Now, the stillness doctrine was what it says. They argue that, well, if you fall into some kind of trouble or difficulty or perplexity, don't pray about it. Seems very strange to say that. Don't read the scriptures and try and find some consolation or help. Basically, just be still. Don't do anything. And wait. And God will resolve it and solve it. Well, it's all wrong, of course, you know that. But strangely enough, Charles Wesley fell for it. Now, he didn't go head over heels in it, but he was interested in it, you may say. But Lady Huntingdon not only prayed for him, but with all her might, told him, don't go down that line. And he didn't. But how history would have been different if he had. And we also know, we'll come to that in a minute, John Wesley did a foolish thing. Really, you can't understand how he did it, but at one of his conferences, he spoke and he gave the impression, I'm sure he didn't mean it, but he gave the impression that good works were necessary for salvation. We all know that good works are evidences of salvation, but I'm sure he didn't do it on purpose, but he gave the impression. And there was a tremendous reaction, which we'll come to in a minute. But she herself, helped in that, as we'll come to. Now, as we're saying, her eyes are going around, her heart is going around to see what else she can do. This is a woman who is out and out. Convicts come into her surveillance, and she can't do anything to alleviate them in one way. At that time, a lot of people were hanged. And a lot more people were sent to places like Australia and on convict ships and so on. But what happens to the family that has now been sent out to Australia or somewhere like that? That they starve. Well, that became a concern for Lady Huntingdon, and much help was given in that area. But all the time, that she is not a social worker in that sense. She's not got a social gospel, but she's got a social concern. What motivates her and inspires her and keeps her going is the gospel. Anyway, she does that. Now, she's very anxious that this gospel is proclaimed. And next thing is that she's going to try and see that an evangelical preacher is in as many parish church pulpits as is possible. And she has got contact with these various men, and she is seeking to persuade them to preach here or preach there or whatever, which for a while she does. But it's something that couldn't really be kept up. It would be impossible. And this is the point now where she starts to build her own chapels, the Countess of Huntingdon's Connection, as we know it today. She, in the very beginning, she built 64 meeting houses. Now, those that were going to preach in them had to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. And they had to use the Book of Common Prayer in the services. She didn't want to cause any schism between the National Established Church if she could help it. But there were many in the established church that were being forced out, really, subtly forced out because they were evangelicals. And these she was organizing to preach in these chapels. She was what you might call a church secretary. She, not just managing one church or course, she was seeing 64 chapels. You've got to find a preacher for one of these, 52 weeks in the year. You would think that would be a full-time job in and of itself. But that's what she was doing. There was even one of these chapels in Bath. It's still there, but it's not opened as a chapel. It's a museum, sadly. It had in the corner of it what they called a Nicodemus corner. And that was, say you were a bishop in the Church of England and you wanted to hear a good sermon. Well, you could go there, but what they're going to say when a bishop turns up, or what would people say? So you could go into the Nicodemus corner behind a screen and you could sit there incognito and listen to a good sermon. Well, that happened. By 1789, she had 116 chapels open, all paid for and organized herself. She was even at that time interested in Sierra Leone in Africa. 20 schools, 30 chapels and 20 schools were set up in that area at this time. Now, it was getting increasingly difficult, though, to get these evangelical Church of England vicars, or whatever we're going to call them, to preach in these many, many chapels. And so she began a process of appointing chaplains to herself. Now, somebody at that position in those days was entitled to have a chaplain, full-time chaplain. But she had, I'm just looking for the figure here, it was a great number of chaplains. I can't see where it is in my notes, but she certainly had more than 20 chaplains, which was highly irregular. But she was paying these men, and she was appointing them to preach in these churches. But I imagine the Church of England authorities were getting increasingly upset by this. And the thing came to a head when she hired a large hall in London called the Pantheon. And her idea was that this would be a prominent place in London, and if she could get preachers to preach there, that would be very, very beneficial. But she came up against laws of the Church of England that Church of England ministers shouldn't be preaching in unlicensed church. It had to be a proper church. And she came up against this snag, and she couldn't go ahead. And so she decided there she would become independent. She would become free church, if you like. So she could do almost as she pleased, as it were, with these buildings. And she became a dissenter, you may say. That's how that came about. Now, I am hurrying on because I know you're very tired. But I can't miss out the college at Trevecca, the parish of Talgarth, Mid Wales, not far from Brecon. The building was bought to be a Bible college for training ministers. The story of the house is interesting, but I'll just tell you it had been part of a castle originally built in 1176, very old place. And it was opened by George Whitefield in 1768, who preached from Exodus 20:24, "In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee and bless thee." There's plenty of descriptions of it by those who attended the college. They'll tell you that she almost watched over the students as if she was their mother. Very, very intense and careful encouragement of these men, praying for them. She provided horses for them to go out to preaching engagements and so on. She even washed their clothes, I think, or certainly had the clothes washed, and looked after these men. And so, and that's another story really. The students every week were sent out either near or far to some church or other. All the time they were going out every weekend. And it's also said that you knew when you were getting near the college, because it was surrounded by woodland really, but you would hear as you got near to it the voice of prayer. It wasn't coming from the college itself, but there were groups of men, students, somewhere in the woods, 2 or 3, 3 or 4 of them, more perhaps, gathering for prayer. It was a highly spiritual place. Now the president of the college was John Fletcher of Madeley, and the supervisor was Joseph Benson. Now this is where things went wrong, of course, because as I alluded to at the beginning, John Wesley at one of his conferences gave the impression that works needed to be added to faith in order to have salvation. We know that he didn't really mean it, but he was foolish pressing it. And so the Countess felt that she couldn't go on with this union between the two groups of Methodism, the two branches. And John Fletcher, he was never permanent, because he would have been a Wesleyan follower sort of thing. He was never officially, I don't believe, put out from his position, but she took over all the responsibilities of it. So I don't quite know how that worked out. But Joseph Benson resigned. And so it seriously affected the college, really. But the college, nevertheless, did the right thing in that case and carried on. Now, we have small numbers of students here, but they didn't have very large numbers at the college, I would just point out. The average intake could be fewer than 12, so not great vast numbers. And the course was to last for 3 years, but very, very few students stuck it out for the 3 years. Not because there was anything wrong with the course, but because such was the spiritual need in the nation, and such was the heart of the students, that they couldn't wait that long to go out with the gospel. So that happened. During the time that the college existed, 150 students passed through it. Now when I say existed, that was there in Trevecca. Later on in Victorian times it moved to Cheshunt in Hertfordshire. But by that time it was losing its evangelical distinctives. Now, nearly finished. The Countess of Huntingdon's ministry stretched beyond the shores of Britain. We've alluded to that. She had an interest in the then 13 colonies of America, though we were shortly to lose those colonies. She certainly had an interest in the plight of the Red Indians, or Native Americans as they call them these days. She was interested in the college in South Carolina, and the Bethesda Home for Boys. Whitefield had a big part in that, you remember. There was all the complication of discovering that they owned slaves. That's a massive subject, but that all had to be resolved and sorted out. It was a distant connection in a sense, I hasten to add. But part of her, that sparked her off with an interest in slaves. And as the slaves were released from their slavery, as it were, she continued to take an interest in them. And particularly, she supported the publication of works, spiritual works, by the freed slaves. I've got a long list here of all the ones she helped and encouraged, but I won't read all that out now. Some of the freed slaves were given land in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and that area up in the north. And again, the Countess was interested in that and sent two missionaries out at the very beginning of that, John Marant and William Firmage, to evangelize these free slaves. I've already mentioned West Africa. She was interested in work going on there. In the South Sea Islands, she had a hand in that, and continued interest in the Indians or North American natives, as it were. Now, to sum up all the aspects of this good lady's commitment to the work of God would take us rather a long time. Some of her activities were negative. What do I mean by that? Well, in that time, the time of George III, apparently the Archbishop of Canterbury in Lambeth Palace down in London would have at least an annual ball. Can you imagine that? It's a wonder they don't bring it back the way they're going on. But at least an annual ball. And of course, Lady Huntingdon didn't think this was in any way remotely appropriate. And she approached the King, George III, about this. And lo and behold, after a very short time, such carryings on cease. That was the sort of thing she would do. But that was a negative, in one sense, thing that she did. She stopped things going on that shouldn't have been going on. She spent over 50 years more than £100,000 in her activities, which almost basically bankrupted her, really. Everything she put into the work. Now, I give you a quote from Cardinal Newman, as it's the end of the day. May make you sit up and think, what's he going to say now? Well, I stumbled on this, and what was his description of our good friend, the Countess? Well, he called her, in the first place, the great high priestess of a poisonous heresy. The great high priestess of a poisonous heresy. But he did have something good to say about her. He had to admit that in spite of everything, she was an example of one who simply and unconditionally gave up this world for the next. A representative in an evil day of the rich becoming poor for Christ, a delicate woman putting off their soft attire and wrapping themselves in sackcloth for the kingdom of heaven's sake. As long as she had money, she built churches all over the country and sold her jewels to build more. Well, it wasn't bad in the end, what he said, was it? Now, one final quote is from Frank W. Borum. I always think that's an unfortunate name for a preacher, really, and I hope I haven't done that. But anyway, you know, he has a little series of books where I think he imagines them, really, that what text would suit which individual, and it can be quite revealing. And I'll tell you what he said. He said, all we have said of her was the superstructure, not the foundation. A few weeks before she died, she put her faith in writing. I do hereby declare, she said, that all my present peace and my hope of future glory depends wholly, fully, and finally upon the merits of Jesus Christ, my Lord and Saviour. I commit my soul into his arms unreservedly as a subject of his sole mercy to all eternity. Adding, there is but one foundation. There is but one foundation on which a sinner like me can rest. And so she departed this life. A noble woman, and we've just touched on something of the nature of